I have finished reading the 1,400 page Bible and I don't even know where to begin. Should I start by telling y'all about the genocide, the horrible laws, the slavery in the Old Testament, or should I start with the misogyny in the New Testament? The Old Testament revolves around a deity named Yahweh. He created and he perpetuated all of the harmful norms in Israel. He taught his people how to do war, chaos, destruction, death, killing. The New Testament, aka the last 300 pages of the Bible, it talks about this guy named Jesus who claims to be the son of Yahweh. Yahweh's entire mission within the Bible was to get praise and to get worship. If you read it, all of the themes are that you are supposed to worship him and you die if you worship anybody else. Jesus talks about his father Yahweh and how Yahweh is going to come down and destroy everyone. So he's preaching about repentance. Y'all need to save yourselves before my father comes and destroys everything, because Yahweh is the God of war. I like to differentiate the different testaments by their parenting styles. Yahweh is very much an abusive, authoritarian father. You don't listen to me, you don't obey me, oh, you're dead. You literally are slaughtered. What? Jesus, when he comes in the last 300 pages, he leads by a different example. Jesus doesn't just tell people he has power and then if you don't bow down to this power, I'm going to kill you. He says, I'm going to heal you instead. Jesus feeds the hungry. He clothes the poor. He helps people even if they're not worthy of it, while Yahweh just, kills them and genocides them and puts them through famine and plague. It's great! The Bible in a whole, though, is definitely from a time period where humans didn't know nearly enough to actually understand what was happening to them. Have you ever been raised in an abusive environment and so you've never known any other environment other than abuse, so you perceive it to be love and healthy since you don't know anything else? The Bible is unfortunately the same, to where these people don't know that wrath isn't a good testament of love. It's a testament of someone who's been hurt and they're hurting you in response to it. Wrath, jealousy, callousness are not good signs of leadership, but some people perceive it to be because that's all they've ever known. This book teaches a lot of themes of righteousness and wickedness. If you're wicked, it's because you don't follow and obey God. People are always taught that anybody who's wicked, anyone who doesn't obey God, is just this overtly evil person. The Bible is just a horrific time documented. The people outside of Israel were acting in horrible ways and the people in Israel were acting in horrible ways. This was a time period where they didn't have phones, y'all. They didn't have technological devices to where they could learn things. They only knew what their environment taught them. Of course they were stupid, ignorant, and harmful. They perpetuated ideologies that God was teaching them. All they were taught was war, so of course all they knew was violence. People love to use this argument about free will, and people were so evil because they had free will and they sinned and ate the apple of knowledge of good and evil. It was the knowledge of good and evil. They would have been good and evil, they just wouldn't have been knowledgeable. They would have been ignorant to their own good acts and their own bad acts. They wouldn't have known because they wouldn't have had the knowledge. It's not like they created good and evil, they just became knowledgeable of it. We have free will in our nowadays times. This was 2,000, almost 3,000 years ago, depending on the New or Old Testament. Why was life worse whenever humans had free will and were being reigned by the most powerful God in the world? But it's better now that we still have free will and we've been able to educate ourselves and have more compassion and empathy. There are some countries in the world where they're shutting down prisons and people are actually able to have free healthcare, free education, and actually have housing without any type of stress. Free will has always existed. We've always inherently had free will. It's just that God wasn't a good leader and you've been taught to think otherwise. Good leadership is knowing whenever a consequence is going to be efficient and whenever it's going to teach the lesson the person is lacking. If your intention is to have a disgustingly unwise, obedient society, this book is perfect for you. But if you want a society of wise people who are knowledgeable and can teach themselves those lessons as well as their children without needing someone to hover over them to do that, that's probably better leadership. In Psalms and Proverbs, a lot of the themes is that the wisdom and knowledge of the world is obedience of God. Obedience is being able to tell someone something and they do it because you said so. Wisdom is someone doing something because they understand the reasoning of why they are doing it. Wisdom and knowledge is not the authority or respect of your leader. Wisdom is quite literally the opposite of because I said so. It's because I understand so. Whenever I talk about the Bible, it is so disheartening whenever people just instantly refer to the New Testament. Whenever I talk about the Bible, I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, the majority of this damn book. This little sliver of pages that took me a couple days to get through while this took me almost a year, this is the Bible. This is the New Testament. If I'm referencing the Old Testament, if I'm referencing the Bible and you say that's the Old Testament, that the New Testament is the way of life, not everyone believes in your religion. That is just the Christian doctrine. The Christian doctrine is the one that believes in the New Testament. Christians don't own this book. Let's also talk about how Yahweh has no regard for people's free will. In certain parts of the book, he hardens kings' hearts so that way they go to war with Israel, so that way Israel can take all of their belongings and all of their land. God has all of his people, the Israelites, kill children, kill infants, kill women, kill pregnant women. It's fucked. I think we both can agree that people killing their children for their gods and sacrificing them to their gods is horrible, but why can't we agree that killing children as a product of war is also just as evil? Or is it because it's war, so that justifies it? Because war is the most mature way of handling conflict. God is timeless, but he hasn't been able to find a way how to handle conflict without war? That really says something if he's an eternal God. At one point in the book, he also has King David make a decision, because King David counted his soldiers. Let's take a moment of silence with that. He counted his soldiers, and he didn't blindly trust God. And so God was like, you're so fucked for that. You counted your soldiers? Okay, 3 options. You can spend 3 years in famine, 3 months running from your enemies, or 3 days of plague. And David was like, oh my God, anything but running from my enemies, Lord. Give us the plague. And so 70,000 people died as a result of one man's actions. That's what we in modern times call a war crime. God doesn't kill anybody unless they're deserving of it. Well, what did they do to deserve that? I want to go into the Old Testament for hours and hours, but I'm gonna finish this off about the Old Testament on one last thing. In the very start of the Bible, in Genesis, in the first few pages, God shows himself to be the biggest fucking liar in the world. He tells Adam and Eve that they will surely die if they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They can eat from any other tree, but not that one. And please remember that Adam and Eve do not have the knowledge of good or bad right now. They don't know the difference. They don't know how to discern good or bad. And if we remember, disobedience is bad, right? And obedience is good. How the fuck are they supposed to know that? How are they supposed to know that obedience is good and disobedience is evil if they don't have the knowledge of good or evil? The serpent starts to tell Adam and Eve, if you eat from this tree, God knows that you will not die, but you will become like him, knowing good and evil. God even confirms this after they eat from the tree, being like, oh my God, they're now like us, knowing good and evil. We cannot let them eat from the tree of life because then they'll live eternally. They weren't eternal before because they hadn't eaten from the tree of life. In general, the Old Testament is just really bad, and obviously it's history. It's bound to be bad. What did you expect? I just didn't expect God to be the one commanding a whole lot of the violence that was happening. The New Testament is really admirable, at least the Gospels talking about Jesus. I love a lot of Jesus' actions and I can get behind a lot of them. But most of it is just Paul's doctrine. It felt like reading fan fiction that Paul was reading, even though he had never met Jesus before. But to conclude this video, to conclude this series, please just read the Bible. I don't want you to give a fuck about my opinions. I don't want you to give a fuck about my interpretations. I'm a silly little girl who read it. I'm stupid. Read it yourself.